On a quiet desert night, Abraham stood beneath countless stars, overwhelmed by the promise God had spoken over his life. He was old, Sarah was barren, and the future seemed impossible. Yet God told him, "Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky." In that sacred moment, Abraham chose faith over fear. He trusted God even when he could not see the outcome, and that impossible promise would one day change his history forever. Inside the quiet tent, Sarah listened as heavenly visitors spoke with Abraham outside. When she heard that she would have a child in old age, she laughed in disbelief. After years of pain, waiting, and disappointment, the promise sounded impossible. But God asked a powerful question: "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" In the middle of doubt, God was still working. What Sarah thought was over, heaven had only just begun. Leaving everything behind, Abraham and Sarah stepped into the unknown, with nothing but God's promise to guide them. They walked through endless deserts, uncertain roads, and unfamiliar lands, trusting a future they could not yet see. Every step required faith, every mile tested their heart, but sometimes God's call you away from comfort so He can lead you into destiny. Their journey was not built on certainty, it was built on trust. In the middle of the wilderness, Abraham stopped to build an altar to God. Before the promise was fulfilled, before the miracle arrived, he chose to worship. While others would complain in uncertainty, Abraham trusted heavens even in silence. The desert around him was empty, but faith was full. Sometimes the greatest act of faith is thanking God before the answers appear. Late at night, Sarah sat quietly inside her tent, holding years of hidden pain in her heart. She had prayed, waited, and hoped for the child, but time kept passing. The silence felt heavy, the dream felt distant, yet even in tears, God had not forgotten her. What seemed delayed to Sarah was never forgotten by heaven. Sometimes God works quietly in the waiting season. One night, God called Abraham into his presence and gave him a new name, Abraham, meaning father of many nations. Nothing around him had changed yet, but heaven had already spoken his future. God changed his identity before changing his circumstances. But that promise still looked impossible. But faith began with believing what God said, even before seeing the evidence. When Sarah heard she would have a child, she laughed quietly to herself. The promise sounded too impossible, too late, too unrealistic. But God heard her laughter and reminded her that nothing is impossible for Him. Sometimes faith begins when human understanding ends. Sarah's laughter started in doubt, but soon it will turn into joy. Under the endless night skies, God reminded Abraham of his covenant. The stars above him became a picture of generation yet to come. Abraham could not see how it would happen, but he chose to believe anyway. Faith is trusting God even when the future remains hidden. The heavens themselves become proof that God's promises are bigger than human limits. As the morning sun rose across the desert, something changed inside Sarah. The sadness that once filled her heart slowly gave way to hope. She still did not understand how the promise would happen, but for the first time in years she believed again. Sometimes healing begins quietly, long before the miracles arrive. Then the impossible finally happened. Sarah gave birth to a son just as God has promised. They named him Isaac, which means laughter. The child that once thought impossible became living proof that God never fails. Every tear, every prayer, every year of waiting had led to this moment. What God promised, He fulfills. Abraham lifted baby Isaac towards the heavens with tears in his eyes. The same God who spoke beneath the stars had now fulfilled his promise. Years of waiting turned into overwhelming gratitude. Abraham realized that God's timing may be feel slow, but it is always perfect. Sarah watched over Isaac with deep love and gratitude. Every moment with him felt precious because she remembered the years she thought this blessing would never come. God had turned her sorrow into joy. The prayers she cried in secret had now become a miracle she could hold her in arms. One quiet night, Abraham prayed beneath the stars while the camp slept around him. Faith had carried him through uncertainty, fear, and impossible seasons. Even when answers seemed delayed, he continued trusting God. Real faith is not built only in miracles, it is built in quiet moments of surrender. Sarah smiled as she watched Isaac run through the camp, laughing with joy. The child she once believed she would never have now filled her days with happiness. Every laugh reminded her that God can restore what feels lost forever. The waiting season had not been wasted. Abraham looked at Isaac and remembered the night God first showed him the stars. What once seemed impossible had become reality. The promise that began in faith had now become legacy. God had remained faithful through the every season. After years of trials and waiting, Abraham and Sarah walked through the desert side by side, stronger than before. The journey was not easy, but faith carried them forward. Together, they learned that God's promises are worth every season of waiting. One peaceful night, Sarah knelt beside the sleeping Isaac and thanked God with tears in her eyes. The pain of yesterday had become the testimony of today. Heaven had heard every silent prayer she once whispered in dark. Under the sky full of stars, Abraham thought Isaac about God's promises. He told him how faith carried her family through impossible seasons. The promise was no longer only for Abraham, it would continue through generations. Together, Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac looked across the land God has promised them. The journey had been long, but God remained faithful through it all. What started as one impossible promise will one day bless nations. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Abraham and Sarah watched Isaac walk towards the future God has promised. Their lives became a testimony that God's promises never fail. What began beneath the stars will continue through generations forever. Their story was filled with waiting, tears, prayers, doubts, and miracles. But through every impossible moment, God continued working. Abraham and Sarah discovered that faith does not depend on circumstances, it depends on trusting God.
Fading light, drifting slow, letting go